You recognize the gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. The chairman said earlier this morning that this was like a novel, but he didn't say which one it was. I've been experiencing something like Alice in Wonderland, although the early questioners reminded me a little bit more of the 2-minute hate sessions in George Orwell's 1984. I don't know whether either of you wanted to volunteer a literary analogy for us to understand what's taking place today. Okay, no? All right, well, if it occurs to you,
we'll
let
have
me
to
know.
think about that, Congressman.
Our Republican colleagues seem really upset with the Department of Justice and the FBI to the point of rudeness and incivility, but I can't quite figure out why. Starting with personnel, Mr. Rosenstein, you are a distinguished law enforcement officer of 21 years experience in law enforcement. I know that you were a Republican appointed by a Republican president to be U.S. attorney, and as far as I know, you're still a Republican appointed by a Republican president, President Trump, to be the Deputy Attorney General. Robert Mueller spent 28 years in law enforcement. He was a U.S. attorney in 2 different states, a decorated war hero, again, a lifelong Republican. And Mr. Wray, I understand you've spent at least 8 or 9 years in law enforcement. You have been also a Republican, a lifelong Republican. You've given tens of thousands of dollars to Republicans and to your law firm's political action committee, including to candidates like John McCain and Mitt Romney, and so on. Is there a Republican partisan conspiracy and witch hunt against a Republican president taking place, Mr. Wray?
Congressman, as I've said repeatedly, I do not believe Special Counsel Mueller is on any kind of witch hunt.
Okay. The special counsel has actually been remarkably productive in its work. 22 people and businesses have been charged with 75 criminal charges. There have already been 5 guilty pleas from Michael Flynn, Rick Gates, George Papadopoulos, Alex von der Zwaan, and Richard Pineda. One person's already been sentenced. You could compare that to the Ken Starr Whitewater investigation, which lasted 4 years and produced nothing, or the 7 congressional committees that went after the Benghazi Holy Grail and came back with nothing, including our beloved Mr. Gowdy. That took more than 3 years, and yet in less than 2 years, we've got 22 people and companies charged. Have there been any complaints about the guilty pleas or those criminal indictments from any members of Congress that you're aware of, Mr. Rosenstein?
Sir, if I could just make 2 corrections. I've spent 28 years in federal law enforcement, 29 years in the service of the government. I sometimes round up to 30. With regard to the Starr investigation, I would take issue with your suggestion that it produced nothing because, as you may be aware, I worked in that investigation. I was involved in a trial that resulted in the conviction of 3 defendants for fraud. But the Starr investigation, as I discuss in my letter of yesterday, is somewhat different. Director Mueller understands that the goal here is to keep the investigation focused and to conclude it as expeditiously as possible.
Well, and I appreciate that. And of course, the purpose of any criminal investigation is justice, ultimately. And we need to allow law enforcement to proceed on its own terms, following the rules and the procedures of law enforcement in order to arrive at a just result. But the whole suggestion here today is that there's some kind of partisan conspiracy afoot. And let me just ask you, just to be clear about it, Ms. Rosenstein, is there a Republican partisan conspiracy within the highest ranks of law enforcement at the Department of Justice against a Republican president?
No.
Okay. Do you believe that the complaints that are being directed at you today are because you're not doing your jobs or because you are doing your jobs? Starting with you, Mr. Rosenstein.
Well, Congressman, I'm reluctant to characterize what people's motivations are, but I can assure you that we are doing our jobs and we're doing them properly.
Okay. Mr. Gowdy said before that America is being torn apart. And of course, we've seen in the last several weeks, thousands of families actually being torn apart in America. But I agree with Mr. Gowdy that America is being torn apart by these outrageous and incessant attacks on distinguished law enforcement personnel at the Department of Justice and law enforcement officers at the FBI for partisan purposes. All of this presents a huge threat to the rule of law in America. One party controls the House of Representatives, as you've seen today, the United States Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court, obviously, after the sandbagging of President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. So they control the House, the Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court, and they seem to want to control the Department of Justice and the FBI. So I just want to ask you, can you restate what you think the role of law enforcement is in terms of upholding the rule of law against attempts at partisan interference and manipulation? Mr. Wray, could I begin with you?
Congressman, our mission is to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution, and that is our only loyalty.
Okay, and Mr. Rosenstein?
Congressman, I understand the concerns about the controversial nature of this investigation and the things that are happening. It would have been better if Russian agents had not interfered with the election. It would have been better if folks who have acknowledged that they lied to the FBI had not lied to the FBI. It would have been better if people had not made these mistakes and demonstrated this bias, but we're in a position where those things have happened. The best that we can do is to try to do our jobs faithfully, to obey our oath, and I believe, Congressman, that ultimately the American people will regain, those who have lost, will regain confidence because they know they have Chris Wray running the FBI properly. They know the folks running the department are making decisions properly. And my hope is that that will be the end result, but I recognize people have legitimate reasons to be concerned.
Thank you for your service. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.